The last time Nora Sims dropped her change into that jar, she was in a hurry. She had a 9 o'clock meeting on the 43rd floor, her coat was damp from the November rain, and the morning was already pressing against her from every direction. She set her usual coffee on the counter, handed over a $10 bill, and when the young woman behind the register pushed the coins toward her, Nora waved her hand and said what she always said, "Keep the change." She said it the way some people say, "Good morning." Without thinking, without wait. What she did not know was that in 8 years of saying it, she had never once said it to the same young woman twice. And she did not know that the young woman behind this particular counter on this particular wet November morning had been listening to those 3 words for 4 of those 8 years, had been counting them, had been building something out of them that the woman in the wet coat could not have imagined if she had tried. Her name was Deshara Watts. She was 27 years old, and she had been working the opening shift at that coffee counter since she was 23, which meant she had been rising at 4:30 in the morning for 4 years to be standing behind that register by 5:45, which meant she had watched the sun come up over the city from a window that smelled like espresso and bleach more times than she could count. She was studying nursing, not full-time, not with the luxury of a schedule that made sense. She took 2 classes a semester at the community college 6 blocks east, paying as she went, because she had no other way to pay. A financial aid form sat in a manila envelope on her kitchen table for 2 years before she filled it out, not because she didn't want the help, but because the form asked about her household income, and her household income included her mother, who was on disability, and her younger brother Caleb, who was 17, and who Deshara was quietly, methodically keeping in school by making sure there was food in the apartment and that the lights stayed on. The form did not have a box for that kind of math, so she paid as she went. She had a notebook where she kept a running total. $312 left on the fall semester tuition, $45 still owed for the lab fee. The state licensure exam cost $220, and she was not allowed to think about that yet. She kept the notebook in her locker at work, behind the stack of paper towel rolls. The counter opened at 5:30 in the morning, and the first customers came in already suited, already caffeinated on whatever they had made at home, already scrolling their phones. Deshara learned early that the early morning was its own kind of city, separate from the one that appeared after 8. The people who moved through it before 7 were people whose days were arranged in a particular way, people who had meetings and offices and schedules that required them to be somewhere before the light was fully established. They did not look at each other much. They moved with purpose and with the quiet of people who had somewhere important to be and were already late for it. Deshara looked at all of them, not because she was lonely, though there were mornings when the counter felt very small. She looked at them the way she looked at the clinical skills she was practicing in her coursework, carefully and with attention, trying to understand the texture of how people move through difficulty and effort and the demand of a life they had chosen. She had a professor in her second year, a woman named Dr. Cole, who said that a nurse's most important instrument was observation. Not the stethoscope, not the blood pressure cuff, not the dosage chart. Observation. Knowing how to read a person before they told you what was wrong with them. Deshara practiced every morning. If you were a regular at that counter and you paid with cash, which in this neighborhood most of the professionals did because they were in too much of a hurry to fumble with their phones, you learned quickly that there were 2 types of tippers. There were the people who waited for their change, took it, and left it on the counter so that Deshara had to sweep it up herself, and there were the people who waved it off with some version of keep it. Nora was the second kind. She came in every weekday morning at 7:43, almost without exception, and she ordered the same thing every time. A medium dark roast, black, no room. She paid with a 10. The coffee cost $3.75. Her change was $6.25. $6.25, Monday through Friday. Over 4 years, in the week she was in town, that was a number that Deshara had never added up. She did not let herself add it up, because numbers like that, spread across years, had a way of making you feel something you couldn't afford to feel during a morning shift. She remembered every single time. She remembered the morning she was 3 days from her mother's rent being late, and Nora came in with her umbrella still dripping and said, "Keep the change," without breaking stride toward the door, and Deshara held that $6.25 in her hand for a moment before putting it in the jar, because it was the difference between the rent being late and the rent not being late. She didn't use it for herself, she put it in the jar. She remembered the first week of October 2 years in, when a man in a grey suit had come in behind Nora and watched the exchange and then leaned toward Deshara and said, conspiratorially, that some of those downtown women were just performing generosity, that it was all for show, that she shouldn't read too much into it. Deshara had smiled at him and said nothing. She handed him his coffee. She put his change in the jar. She had decided something about Nora a long time ago, and a man in a grey suit was not going to revise it. What she had decided was simple enough. Nora didn't know she was watching. Nora didn't perform. She was always rushing, always with her mind somewhere else, always pushing through the door before the cup had finished its journey across the counter. She did not linger to see if Deshara was grateful. She did not leave the tip and then look up to check that it had been noticed. She just left it. The way you leave a light on in an empty room because it seems like the right thing to do. Deshara respected that more than she could say. She had a friend from her old church, Renata, who sometimes stopped by the counter in the mornings when she was passing through downtown. Renata was 2 semesters ahead of her in the nursing program, and she was the one who had first told Deshara that there were private scholarships worth applying for, small grants given by businesses and foundations that most people didn't know about because they weren't advertised the way the big federal ones were. "You have to write an essay," Renata told her, her elbows on the counter, turning the coffee cup in her hands, "about what you're doing and why." "A real one." "An essay," Deshara said. "You know how to write an essay. I know how to write a nursing care plan." Renata had laughed. "Same thing. Both of them are just telling somebody what you're going to do and why it matters." Deshara wrote the essay that winter. She sat at the kitchen table with Caleb doing his homework beside her, and she wrote about her mother, who had been a home health aide herself before her back gave out, and about the apartment they lived in, where the radiator made a sound like a kettle every night at 11, and about what she was working toward. She wrote about what she saw every morning at that counter, about the way the city moved through at dawn, about all the people going to all their different places, and how she wanted to be the kind of person in a hospital corridor who moved through the world with that same quiet, unhurried purpose. She wrote a draft and then wrote it again. She read it to herself in the bathroom at 2 in the morning with the door closed so she would not wake Caleb. And she changed 3 sentences that sounded too much like asking for pity and replaced them with sentences that sounded more like what she actually believed. She was not writing to be pitied, she was writing to be understood. The 3rd draft was the one she submitted. She submitted the essay to 11 different private foundations, and she did not hear back from 7 of them, and she received a rejection from 2 and a small grant from $300, which she used to pay the lab fee and most of the fall semester, and she cried a little in the car on her way to work when the letter came. Not because $300 solved anything, but because someone had read what she wrote and thought it was worth something. $300 was not nothing. She wrote that in the notebook too, not as an amount, but as a single word. Received. 1 word on a line by itself. She looked at it on the train to work, and she kept going. The nursing program was 4 semesters long, and she was running out of road. The spring of her 3rd year, Deshara did the math for the first time. She sat in the break room on a Thursday afternoon with the notebook open and her phone's calculator beside it, and she looked at what she still owed and what she was likely to make between now and the end of the semester. And the number that came out on the other side of that equation was a gap she could not close by herself, not without dropping a class, not without taking a semester off, not without pushing her graduation back by 12 months, which meant 12 more months of opening shifts, 12 more months of being bone-tired at 8 in the morning, 12 more months of Caleb being in high school without the kind of stability she wanted him to have before she could make a different kind of life. She did not tell Renata this, she did not tell her mother. She went home, made dinner, helped Caleb with a paper on the Louisiana Purchase, and went to bed. The next morning she was back behind the counter at 5:45. Nora came in at 7:43. "Keep the change," she said. Deshara put the money in the jar. If you are someone who has ever worked a job where you were mostly invisible, you know what it does to you over time. Not the exhaustion, though that is real, not the aching feet or the early hours or the particular indignity of certain customers. It is the invisibility itself, the way you can be the first person someone sees in a day and still somehow not register as a person to them. The way you can hand someone the thing that gets their morning started, and they can look directly at you and still not quite see you. Deshara had a pair of shoes she wore to work that she had bought on sale 3 winters ago, and the left one had a small seam coming apart at the toe, and she had repaired it twice with a tube of fabric adhesive she kept in the bathroom cabinet, and every morning when she put them on, she thought the same thing. One more month, and there will be room in the budget. There never was. But she kept the shoes neat. She kept her name badge polished. She kept the counter clean enough that Pryor did not have to remind her, and Pryor was a woman who noticed everything. Deshara was used to invisibility. She had made her peace with it a long time ago. Nora had never made her feel invisible. That was the thing, that was what Deshara had decided back at the beginning when she was new to the counter and still figuring out the rhythms of the room. Nora was distracted, and she was hurried, and she did not have long conversations, but she looked at Deshara when she handed over the coffee. She used her name after the 3rd time she'd seen it on the name badge. She asked once, one rainy Tuesday, how Deshara's morning was going, and when Deshara said, "Long already," Nora had laughed a real laugh and said, "Same." And it was a small thing, the kind of small thing that evaporates as soon as it happens, but Deshara had held it for a moment before the next customer stepped up. She knew it would not occur to Nora to do more than that. That was not the nature of what they were. Nora had a meeting on the 43rd floor. Deshara had a coffee counter and a nursing program and a brother doing his homework at the kitchen table. They were not in each other's lives. They were in each other's mornings. That was enough. Deshara had decided that was enough. In the 4th year, the jar changed. The counter, where the tips went, had always been a plain glass jar wide enough to hold a decent stack of bills and the loose change that accumulated through the shift. But the morning manager, a compact woman named Priya, who ran the counter like a watch and never raised her voice, had replaced it with a larger one, and on the new jar she had taped a strip of paper that said, in her small, precise handwriting, "Deshara's goal." Deshara had not asked her to do this. Priya had done it on a Tuesday morning while Deshara was wiping down the milk steamer, and when Deshara turned around and saw it, she had stood there for a moment with the cloth in her hand, not sure what to say. "You said you had 1 semester left," Priya said, not looking up from the pastry case she was stocking. "You told me last month, 1 semester left, and you don't have the tuition." "I'm figuring it out." "You've been figuring it out for 4 years, Priya said. "Let other people figure with you." The jar stayed. The regulars noticed it. A few of them asked, and Deshara explained, and most of them nodded and left what they left and moved on with their mornings. The jar filled faster than it had before. Not enough, but faster. Nora noticed it on a Wednesday. She had stopped at the counter, received her coffee, said, "Keep the change," the way she always did, and was already turning toward the door when she stopped and looked back. Deshara saw her eyes find the jar. She saw her read the strip of paper. Nora looked at Deshara. Deshara looked back. "Nursing school?" Nora said. "Yes, ma'am." Nora nodded once. The way you nod when something confirms what you already sensed. She looked at the jar one more moment. Then she pushed through the door. That was all. Deshara had not expected anything else. The following Monday, Nora came in at 7:43, ordered her medium dark roast, and paid with a 20 instead of a 10. When Deshara slid the change across the counter, Nora said, "Keep the change." It was gone before Deshara had finished counting it. $16.25. Deshara put it in the jar. She opened the notebook that night and she let herself look at the running total. She did not let herself think about why. What Deshara did not know was that Nora Sims had gone to her office that Wednesday morning and had not been able to concentrate on her 9 o'clock. She had sat through it with a strip of paper on the jar in the back of her mind, that particular handwriting, that single word, goal, written in a strip of tape on the glass. She had thought about the young woman at that counter, the one she had been passing a coffee and a wave of her hand to for 4 years, and she had done a calculation that she could not stop doing, no matter how many other things she tried to put in front of it. There were 12 people in the 9 o'clock. Nora had managed risk analysis and quarterly projections and a dispute with a vendor that was going to require a call to legal, and she had sat through all of it at her end of the table and contributed what was required of her, and not one person in that room could have told you she was somewhere else. She was. Nora was 46 years old. She ran the risk management division of a mid-sized holding company on the 43rd floor of a building she could see from the coffee counter. She had 2 daughters in college, one of them studying pre-med, and she knew exactly what tuition cost and what the gap between aid and reality looked like, because she had filled out those forms herself twice and had spent 3 consecutive springs reviewing financial aid packages at a kitchen table while her daughters tried not to look too hopeful. She knew what it looked like when someone was 1 semester from something that would change everything. She also knew what the word goal in someone's handwriting on a jar meant. It did not mean, I hope. It meant, I have been working toward this for a very long time, and I am not done yet. She had not gone to that coffee counter 4 mornings a week for 4 years as a philanthropic gesture. She had gone because it was on her way, and the coffee was good, and the woman behind the counter was efficient and decent and looked her in the eye. She was not able, after that Wednesday, to think about it in those terms only. She thought about her own first apartment, the one she had before the company and the 43rd floor, the one she had when her older daughter was 2 and her younger daughter was not yet born, when she was working as an analyst on a floor she could see from the street. She had a radiator in that apartment that made a sound in the night like something trying to get out. She used to lie awake listening to it and thinking about the 10 years that stood between her and the life she was building toward, and she would make herself say the number of years out loud in the dark, quietly, so she wouldn't wake the baby, not because it made the years shorter, but because naming them made them real. And real things could be crossed 1 year at a time. She thought about that radiator for a long time in her office on the 43rd floor. Then she called her assistant. And asked her to pull the HR contact at a nursing program she had a long-standing corporate relationship with, a partnership that involved internship placements. Her company had co-signed a clinical training agreement with the program 3 years prior. She had attended a luncheon, she had shaken hands with the dean. The connection existed and had never been used for anything personal. The assistant found the contact. Nora sent an email that afternoon. She did not tell Dashara. She had done this, she had not told anyone. She had not told her daughters, who would have thought it was wonderful and would have made it into a story she would then have to inhabit. She did not want it to be a story, she wanted it to be a thing that was done. She came in the next morning, ordered her coffee, said, "Keep the change," and went up to the 43rd floor. The email from the program's HR coordinator came back 2 days later. It was 2 paragraphs, professional and warm, thanking Nora for her inquiry and noting that the financial aid office might be better positioned to speak to scholarship and grant opportunities. Nora forwarded it to the financial aid office with a note that said she had a student she believed met the criteria for a completion grant, if one existed, and that her company maintained discretionary philanthropy funds that had not yet been allocated for the current academic year. The response from financial aid came 3 days after that. It was longer. It explained that a corporate partnership completion grant did in fact exist, one that covered full final semester tuition for students within 12 months of graduation who could demonstrate financial need and continued enrollment. The grant had existed for 2 years and had gone partially unfunded in both of them. They were asking whether her company would consider directing funds toward it this cycle. Nora read the email twice. Then she forwarded it to her CFO with a message that was 3 words long. Yes, this one. This cycle. She did not tell Dashara. She came in the next morning at 7:43. She ordered her coffee. She paid with a 10. "Keep the change," she said, and walked toward the door. The weeks between January and February passed the way winter weeks do in a city that has had enough of winter, slowly and without particular mercy. Dashara worked her shifts. She studied for the clinical skills assessment that was coming in April. She made lunches for Caleb and she checked on her mother, and she took the bus to class twice a week and sat in the third row, because the third row had the best angle on the whiteboard, and she took notes in the same notebook she used for everything, the one that had become a kind of record of the whole 4 years, with the financial tally on the right side of the pages and the clinical notes on the left. She did not think about the grant anymore. She could not afford the weight of thinking about it. She had submitted the paperwork, and now the paperwork was where paperwork went, and there was nothing to do but wait. And waiting was not a thing she had ever been good at, so she had simply decided not to do it. She went to work. She went to class. She came home. She had a clinical rotation at a hospital on the north side that semester, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 hours each, and she had a supervisor there named Marcus, who had been a nurse for 19 years and who told her once, while they were changing a dressing in room 14, that the nurses who lasted were the ones who could hold two things at once: the fear that they were doing it wrong and the certainty that they were going to figure it out. You had to hold both, he said. You couldn't put one of them down. Deshara thought about that on the bus home from the rotation on a Thursday night in February, watching the city lights blur in the rain on the window. Her phone rang at 3:17 the following afternoon while she was restocking napkin dispensers in the back. She almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, a local area code, and she was in the middle of a shift, and Priya was strict about phones on the floor. She stepped into the break room and answered it. The woman on the other end of the line was from the financial aid office at the nursing college. She introduced herself and asked Deshara if she was currently enrolled. Deshara said yes. The woman asked if she had a minute. Deshara said she didn't really, that she was in the middle of a shift, and the woman said this would only take a moment, that she was calling because Deshara had been identified as the recipient of the Sims Waters Corporate Completion Grant for the current academic year. Deshara did not say anything. The woman continued. The grant covered full tuition for the final semester. It had been funded through a corporate partnership and was awarded on the basis of demonstrated financial need and continued enrollment. There was paperwork, which she would send by email. Deshara would need to provide documentation of her current enrollment status, which the school already had on file, and a brief statement confirming her intent to complete the degree. Deshara was still not saying anything. "Miss Watts," the woman said. "Are you there?" "Yes," Deshara said. "I'm here. She stopped. "Take your time," the woman said. Deshara pressed her back against the metal shelving in the break room, in the middle of her shift, with the sound of the espresso machine filtering through the door, and she thought about the notebook in her locker behind the stack of paper towels. She thought about the number she had been staring at for 6 months, number on the other side of the equation that she could not close. "The full semester," she said. "Yes, ma'am. All of it. All of it." Deshara put her hand over her mouth. She did not cry in the break room. She stood there for a moment with her hand pressed to her face, and then she said thank you to the woman on the phone in a voice that came out smaller than she intended, and she said she would check her email for the paperwork, and she hung up. She stood there another moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back out to the counter. Priya looked at her from across the room. Deshara shook her head once because she did not have words for it yet, and Priya seemed to understand that because she nodded and turned back to what she was doing and said nothing. The name of the grant came out in the paperwork. She found it that evening at the kitchen table, Caleb beside her, doing calculus, his pencil scratching the same rhythm it always did. The email from the financial aid office had an attachment, and the attachment was the grant letter, and the grant letter named the funding partnership, and Deshara read the name twice before she understood what she was reading. The holding company on the 43rd floor. She sat with that for a long time. Caleb looked up at her once, and she smiled at him, and he went back to his calculus. The radiator made its kettle sound in the corner. She thought about the woman in the wet coat, pushing through the door, already somewhere else. She thought about the way Nora had stopped at the counter that Wednesday, how she had looked at the jar, how she had read the label and looked back at Deshara without saying anything extra. She had not asked, she had not announced it. She had not even looked up the next morning to see if Deshara knew. There was a word for that kind of giving, and it was not a word Deshara used lightly. But she sat at that table with Caleb's pencil scratching beside her, and she thought that it was the closest thing to grace she had ever seen, that did not happen in a church. She finished the paperwork that night. She confirmed her enrollment. She submitted the statement. She graduated in May. There was no ceremony she could afford to rent a gown for, but the degree came in an envelope and she opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. And Caleb was eating cereal across from her and he said, "Is that it?" And she held it up and he said, "Okay," the way 17-year-olds say things, like they are trying not to make it a big deal. And then he got up and hugged her from behind, both arms around her shoulders the way he used to when he was small, and she held the envelope in both hands and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 4 years. 4 years of 5:45 mornings and 2 classes, a semester and a notebook with a running total on the right side and clinical notes on the left. 4 years of the early bus and the late bus and the rotation on Tuesday and Thursday and the break room and the locker and the paper towel rolls. 4 years of $6.25 Monday through Friday. She held the envelope and she looked at the ceiling. I did that, she thought. I did that. Her mother came in from the bedroom an hour later, moving slowly with her cane, and Dashara showed her. Her mother held the envelope for a long time. She didn't put her glasses on to read it, she just held it, feeling the weight of the paper, and then she looked up at Dashara and her eyes were wet, and she gave the envelope back without speaking and sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface, the way she did when she needed something solid. That was its own kind of everything. The last morning, Dashara worked the opening. Shift was a Friday in June. She got up at 4:30 for the last time and made coffee and stood in the kitchen in the quiet before the apartment woke, and she thought about how many mornings she had stood in exactly this spot, doing exactly this, running the day's arithmetic in her head before the city had fully remembered itself. She had stood here when the rent was late. She had stood here when the notebook balance was a number she did not look at directly. She had stood here on mornings when the weight of everything was so specific and so heavy that she had to set down her coffee cup and press her hands to the counter for a moment before she could pick it back up. She was not doing that this morning. She put on her shoes, the ones with the repaired seam, and she looked at them for a moment. Then she went to work. She had put in her notice the week before. She had a nursing position starting the following Monday, second shift at the hospital 6 blocks from the apartment, which meant she would not be rising at 4:30 anymore, which meant Caleb would have a sister present in the evenings, instead of someone who came home with tired feet and ate dinner, standing over the sink. The shift differential on second shift was 11% above base. She had run the numbers 3 times. Priya gave her a card that the morning regulars had signed, which she found in her locker under the stack of paper towels. Beside the notebook, there were 17 signatures. She recognized most of them by their orders. The woman who always got the oat milk latte with 1 pump of vanilla, the man who came in at 6:15 with a briefcase and always said, "Same as yesterday." A few names she knew from their credit cards, which she had never used to address them, but which she had read enough times to remember. 17 people who had moved through her mornings and left something in the jar and kept going. She held the card for a moment, then she put it in her bag with the notebook. At 7:43, the door opened. Nora came in with her coat over her arm, the November wet weeks behind them now, the morning already warm. She looked up when she crossed the threshold and she saw Dashara, and she stopped. There was something different in her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition of a moment she had been quietly expecting without scheduling it. Dashara looked at her. "Today's my last shift," she said. Nora set her bag down on the counter, which she had never done before. She looked at Dashara for a moment. "Nursing," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I start Monday." Nora was quiet. Then she said, "Where?" "St. Augustine." "Second shift." Nora nodded. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she reached for her wallet and she ordered her coffee, and Dashara made it the same way she had made it for 4 years, medium dark, roast black, no room, and she set it on the counter and Nora paid with a 10. Dashara slid the change across the counter. Nora looked at it, then she looked up. "Keep the change," she said. Dashara held it. She stood there with $6.25 in her hand, and for the first time in 4 years she did not put it in the jar. She held it for one moment, looking at the woman across the counter, and then she said, quietly, "I know It was you. Nora did not look away. She did not offer an explanation or a correction. She simply held Dashara's gaze, and something in her face settled. The way a thing settles when it has finally been said aloud. "I know what the change was," Dashara said. "All of it. I know what you did." Nora picked up her coffee cup. She held it in both hands the way she never did, because she was always in a hurry, but she was not in a hurry now. She looked at Dashara, the way you look at someone when you want to say something, and you are deciding whether it is yours to say. Then she said, "You wrote a very good essay." Dashara blinked. "They sent it to me," Nora said. "Part of the grant documentation. You weren't supposed to know that part." A small pause. "Neither was I, probably." Shara didn't know what her own face was doing. She pressed her lips together. "The part about the radiator," Nora said. "I have one just like it. In an apartment I had when my girls were small." She looked down at her coffee cup. "I hadn't thought about it in years." The morning rush was beginning behind them. Someone pulled open the door and a shaft of June light came in and the counter filled with sound. Neither of them moved. "Thank you," Dashara said, and it came out the way it always did when something costs you, plain and direct, nothing extra added to protect you from how much you mean it. Nora nodded. She picked up her bag from the counter. "Good luck on Monday," she said, and then she pushed through the door, the way she always did, and was gone into the morning. Dashara put the change in the jar one last time. Priya was watching from across the counter. Dashara didn't say anything to her. Priya didn't ask. "Say, Frau." The morning opened up, the way mornings do, one customer after another, and the shift ran until 2 o'clock. And at 2 o'clock, Dashara took off her apron and retrieved the notebook from her locker and stood in the break room for a moment with it in her hands. She opened it to the last page. The final entry was the number that had once looked impossible, the gap she had once stared at in the spring of her 3rd year and could not close. Below it she had written one thing. On the night the grant letter came, 0. She put the notebook in her bag and walked out. There is a particular kind of kindness that does not know it is being observed, that does not calculate its return, that does not require gratitude to keep happening. It simply repeats, morning after morning, year after year, because it is the nature of the person doing it, not the transaction they are completing. It leaves no record in the ordinary sense. It has no ledger entry, no receipt, no documented trail. And then, one day, it does. Caleb graduated high school that same June on a Thursday, and Dashara sat in the gymnasium bleachers with her mother and held the printed program in her hands and did not look at her phone once, which was not something she had been able to say in years. She was on shift at the hospital the following Monday, when a woman was brought into the emergency department at 9:30. A woman in her late 50s with a broken wrist from a fall on a city sidewalk, and the woman's name on the intake form was Eleanor Watts. Dashara was not the intake nurse that night, but she was the one who brought the woman a warm blanket while she waited, and when the woman looked up and said, "Thank you, honey," in a voice that had been crying, Dashara said, "You're all right," and meant it the way she always meant everything she said. She did not think about the jar. She did not think about the notebook. She thought about what she was there to do, and she did it. Moving through the corridor with the quiet, unhurried purpose she had once tried to describe in an essay. It was the only way she knew how to be. She had learned it from watching someone else who didn't know they were being watched. Someone who pushed through a door every morning without looking back to see if the goods she left behind had registered. The degree hung on the wall in the apartment when she got home that night, in a plain black frame Caleb had put up for her without being asked. She stood in the hallway and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and started the water for tea. The radiator made its sound in the corner. She smiled at it. If someone who loves you has ever done a quiet thing for you, the kind of thing you only understood years later, leave that for us down in the comments. We would love to hear it. And if this story moved you, there is another one right here waiting, about a woman who gave something away when she had nothing left, and what came back to her. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, and events are created for dramatic purposes.